Good morning. Good to see everyone. It really is, because I missed you last week, but it's good to be back with you. So much sickness going around. Need to be praying for, our young children, but also everyone, our adults, our teachers, everyone dealing with the sickness going around. I remember at a baseball game years ago, a conversation that was taking place close to me, close enough that I could hear what was being said. And the guy said, man, last night in the basketball game, this guy scored this ridiculous amount of points, a ton of points. And I thought, wow, that's impressive. And he said, he was sick. And I thought, wow. And I turned around and chimed in. I said, he scored that many points and he was sick? That's incredible. And the guy looked at me like I was crazy. And he said, no, he wasn't sick. Sick means good. And I just turned back around because I don't know what he was talking about. But that's the influence of our modern culture on the way we speak. A lot of the things that we do every day is due to the influence of our culture, from the music that we listen to, the shows that we watch, the way we dress, the way we style our hair, has a lot to do with the influence of culture. My question is, how does modern culture affect the Lord's church? Because I believe it does. Turn your Bibles to Ephesians 6. And let's begin with this. Modern culture is under the influence of Satan. We talk about technology, we talk about how far we've come, and we really have. But we've got to be realistic and look at this and say, you know what? Our modern culture, as good as it is, as well as we've done, it's really under the influence of Satan. And we see that daily. Ephesians 6:10 and following confirms for us that we are in a very heated and a very real spiritual war for our souls. To be brutally honest, Satan wants you. Do you remember the commercials, the military commercials? Want you? That's exactly where Satan is. He wants your soul. And we're involved every day in this grind, in this spiritual war against him. Ephesians 6:10 and following says, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, against people. We get caught up in that. We think our battle is with people, but it's really far deeper than that. But against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Our battle is with Satan. Modern culture is under the influence of Satan. We're seeing things in movies, we're seeing things on television today that are really popular, that when I was a kid would have just been, no way that stuff's going to be introduced. No way that's going to be a hit show or a hit movie. Modern culture under the influence of Satan. Look back here with me in a few passages in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 11. I'm going to start in the middle here of a sentence. 2 Corinthians 2 and 11 says, so that we would not be outwitted by Satan, for we're not ignorant of his designs or his schemes. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4. In their case, the God of this world, that Satan, has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So Satan doing all he can to blind those he can from obeying the gospel, from hearing the gospel, understanding the gospel, from believing the gospel. The spiritual war we battle every day. Folks, it's real. It's real. I mean, we're scratching our head watching the news going, I can't believe this is really happening. That's the influence of Satan. In John chapter 8, in verse 44, Jesus would say, you are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there's no truth in him. When he lies, when Satan lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. We see the influence of Satan on culture every single day, everywhere we look. Movies, TV shows that are popular, we see the influence of Satan. School problems have gone from you gotta stop talking to school shootings. Now, pardon me for this parenthesis, but let me have this moment. I know in a post I made in an article that sits in your bulletin, I mentioned 18. Because that's the report I had seen, school shootings. And there's been much, I've read the other articles that say, well, it wasn't 18, or they really weren't all school shootings. I know what the media is doing. The media wants us to believe there's been 18 school shootings just like the tragedy in Florida this year, 2018. And I don't think that's totally accurate. But I got to be honest, what frustrated me was that we got caught up in the numbers. The point is, we see the influence of Satan. If it's 18 or if it's 25 or if it's 3, folks, there's too many school shootings taking place. There are too many church shootings taking place. There's too much violence. It's not just school. And in that, you see the influence of Satan. When abortion is simply another means of birth control, you see the influence of Satan. When there is, and I just learned this within the last month and a half, a prison set aside just for sex offenders. Really? When I learned that, we have that many sex offenders? What's the point in that? Well, because apparently when they put them in general population, they kill them. And so we have so many sex offenders, we have to have a prison just for them. Influence of Satan. I mean, you can't know these details. You can't read the headlines. You can't see the pop television today and not understand modern culture is under the influence of Satan. So many things that are accepted today wouldn't have been accepted in the 70s, 80s, even in the 90s. Modern culture under the influence of Satan. Let's move on. Secondly, go to Mark 16 with me for a minute. Mark 16. I said Mark 16. What I meant was Mark 14. Modern culture is influencing the church. We know modern culture under the influence of Satan. We've said that. We've seen that. We watched that. But modern culture is influencing the church. Look at Mark 14, 66 and following. Let's read this story. You should know it. This is when Peter when he denied Jesus. Jesus told him he would. He said, no, not me. I won't do it. And we know what happens, right? So verse 66, as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, you also were with the Nazarene Jesus. But he denied it, saying, I neither know or understand what you mean. He went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed, and the servant girl saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, this man is one of them. But again he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know this man or whom you speak. Immediately the rooster crowed a second time, and of course we know the story. Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times, and he broke down and he wept. Modern culture influencing the church. Peter says emphatically, I will not disown you. I will not deny you. I would never, I don't care if everybody else does, I won't. And Jesus dates it. Yeah, before the rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times, Peter. And Peter, warming himself with the worldly by the fire, is influenced 3 times to lie. He said he wouldn't do it, but he did. And Peter lied because he was concerned about what those nearby would say. What are the people in the courtyard going to say if I say, well, yeah, I am with Jesus. You see, the whole thing is Peter wants to follow and see what they're going to do to Jesus. Put him before trial, or they're going to crucify him, or they're going to kill him. But he wants to do it from afar. And that's how many of us want to follow Jesus. I don't really want people to know I'm attached to him, but I sure want the salvation that's in Christ. I don't really want people to know I love him, but I sure want him to hear my prayers and answer them. So Peter's following from afar, and then when people recognize him and notice, hey, we know you're with him, you talk like them, you're a Galilean, etc., etc. And Peter's, no, there's no way, not me, I don't know what you're talking about. But his decision to lie and deny Jesus was influenced by the pressures of culture. He was concerned about what those nearby would say or what they might do. If they're going to hurt Jesus, well, they sure might hurt me too if I'm with him. Let's take it a step farther. Modern culture influencing the church, yes, no question. But I'm afraid culture influences the teachings and the practices of Christians. Look at 2 Timothy 4. 2 Timothy 4. In verse 2, Paul would write, preach the word, Timothy. Be ready in season and out of season, reprove and rebuke and exhort and with complete patience and teaching. Now this is why. This is why he's encouraging Timothy to preach the word and be so conscientious of what he teaches. For the time, verse 3, is coming when people will not endure sound teaching. What that says is they're not going to care if it's false or not. They're not going to care if it's Bible or not. They're really not going to care if it has a bearing on their soul eternally or not. So I don't understand. Time will come when people will not endure sound teaching. They're not interested in sound teaching. But having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions. They'll turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. So, that's culture influencing the practices of the church. That's culture saying, oh, we don't care about the Bible. We don't care about truth. We would rather have a great speaker that can entertain us. We'd rather have a great speaker that can tell us what we want to hear, that can tell us how good we are. Not really challenge us, but tell us how good we are. Culture influencing the church. Remember, culture is being influenced by Satan, but modern culture is also influencing the church. As culture loosens its biblical and moral views, the church cannot afford to be influenced. Modern culture says homosexuality and abortion are rights. The Bible says they're wrongs. We're seeing changes in the church that old-timers are saying, I never thought I'd ever see this. And when I say old-timers, I mean with respect. The more seasoned veterans. Is that better? Culture, modern culture influencing the church. I'll never forget, I went years ago back to a place where I had preached for some time, and I was there to do a wedding, kind of in and out type of deal. And I was talking to one of the guys there, maybe he was a deacon, and I said, tell me about your new preacher. How's he doing? He said, oh, he's a great guy. Just went on a wonderful personality. We really like him. On and on and on and on. I said, man, that's fantastic. He said, there's only one problem. And I said, really, what's that? He said, in the pulpit, all he does is preach the word. Well, I was kind of waiting for the punchline. I'm going, okay, what's the problem? And he said, that's all we hear is word, word, word. I didn't know how to respond to that because I thought that's the guy you wanted in the pulpit. So I was a little taken back. That's the influence of modern culture on the church. Modern culture is under the influence of Satan. Modern culture is influencing the church. But here's where we want to go this morning. How the church can influence modern culture. That's our job. That's my responsibility. That's your responsibility as the Lord's people. How do we influence Modern culture. How can we make a difference? How can we turn this wagon around, so to speak? Well, we know from the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus expects us to influence. We hear all the time that the church must have a presence in the community. Yeah, I think that's great. But the church must have more than a presence. The church must have influence. We can have presence all day. People can know we're here. People can know where our building is. People can recognize our sign, even recognize some of our members or the logos we wear on our shirts. People, that's great if there's a presence. But if there's a presence and no influence, it really doesn't matter. We must have an influence. Matthew 5, and you know the text well, Jesus would say in verse 14, you're the light of the world. We just sang that song, didn't we? You're the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, because it would do no good. If you light a lamp, put it under a basket, you put it on its stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So He wants us to influence. Well, I'm going to give you two things this morning before we close out. Two things that must happen for the church to influence the community and culture. And it's not just the community of Cabot. It doesn't matter what community. I hope the churches in most communities throughout the United States and world. But these two things must happen if the church anywhere is going to influence any community that they're in. Romans chapter 12. First of all, let me give you these two subpoints, how the church can influence modern culture. First of all, the church, Christians, you and me, must live transformed lives. We simply must live transformed lives. And when I say live transformed lives, I don't mean we live transformed lives on Sunday and then we live like, can I say this without getting in trouble? We live like hell Monday through Saturday night. Can we do that? No, that's not a transformed life. That's not a transformed life. Romans 12, 1 and 2, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world. In other words, don't be like this world. You used to be, but don't be like this world anymore. But be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Begins right here, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Live transformed lives. Every single day. You say, well, you're saying that I need to be perfect. I'm not saying you need to be perfect because you don't have that ability, nor do I. We're perfect through the blood of Christ only. But a transformed life is a life that has been changed by a relationship with Jesus. It's not been changed by a relationship with your spouse. It hasn't been changed by a relationship with your new best friend. It hasn't been changed by a relationship with your kids. It's been changed by a relationship with Jesus. Okay? Now, a transformed life, it looks like this. Our conduct, our speech, our activities, and our interest are totally different than what they were before we came to Christ. Transformed, changed, different. It's a process. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18 says, and we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed in the same image from the degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. So this idea of living a transformed life, being transformed to be more like Jesus, is a process that begins at baptism. It's a process that doesn't end until we get home to be with Him in heaven. But folks, if we don't live transformed lives, we're not different. And if we don't live transformed lives, we don't stand out. And if we don't live transformed lives, we're not going to convince anyone to come to Christ. Because we're going to blend. We're going to look just like them. We must live transformed lives if we want to influence whatever community we live in. We will never influence our culture for Christ if we don't live transformed lives. If we live like the world, we will never convince the world to live like Jesus. All right, let me give you another subpoint. So we got to live transformed life, but the other thing is this. The church, Christians, you and me, must love unconditionally. We must love unconditionally. You say, oh, this is easy. This is so easy. We got this down. John 13:34 and 35, a new commandment I give you, Jesus says, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. You say, we really have this. We're good at this. We love each other. I think we do. I think we love, I love you. I think you love me. You're patient with my mistakes. I'm with you. But I think it's got to go much deeper than that. It is easy to love those that love you. But folks, we must love everyone unconditionally. In Matthew 5:44, Jesus said, love your enemies. He said, you lost me at enemies. You got that many? Jesus said we got to love them. Christians must love those of the world who don't love us. Christians must love those who disagree with us. Christians, I want you to listen. Christians must love those who are involved in immorality. Christians must love those who love ungodliness. Christians must love those who absolutely live totally against God. We must love them. So I'm a little uncomfortable loving those that are in immorality. I'm not saying become like them. I'm not saying even be best friends with them. I'm not saying condone what their actions are. But we must love them because you know what they say? You're just judging me. You're judging me because I live this alternative lifestyle. You're judging me because I'm not married, or you're judging me because whatever. But see, when we love unconditionally, here's the thing. We love them no matter what state they're in. We want them to come to Christ. But even if they don't come to Christ, we still love them. That's unconditional love. Conditional love would say, well, we'll love you when you come to Christ. When you come to Christ and leave your sinful past, we'll love you then. But that's not what Jesus is teaching, and that's not going to influence culture. Because of the sin, sometimes we don't love. We get so caught up, and let's be really honest for a minute. We get so caught up in how grotesque the sin is, how immoral and ungodly the sin is, how that is on the top of our list of the sin of sins. We get so caught up in that mentality that we can't allow ourselves to love someone that lives that way. That person may never come to Christ. That person may never enter heaven. But I want you to know God loves that person. And God's using you and me, hands and feet, to love them. If we don't love them, they're never going to come to Christ. If we don't love them, we're not going to influence culture. I'm not condoning anything. Let's be clear about that. Whatever their sin is, we love them unconditionally. We just don't like their sin. Is that fair? We love that person unconditionally, and our prayer is that we can influence them, that they'll come to Christ. We just don't like their sin. A transformed life shows we're different. We're different. Unconditional love says we're going to love you no matter what. We want you to come to Christ. But even if you choose not to, we're going to love you anyway. Because of who our Father is. It's an interesting day. Because almost weekly, Joey, I missed last week obviously, but he mentions the officers that were shot or killed. And then this week it's another tragedy. Well, there was a shooting at school. 17 lives were lost. And you know, my thought sitting there a minute ago, I was thinking, well, I wonder what it'll be next week. And I hate to think like that. It bothers me. That's the influence of our culture. That's the influence of our culture. When we're reading the headlines and we're going, oh, another person walked into a church and opened fire. Okay, what's the next story? It doesn't get our attention. It doesn't shock us. We're not blown away by that.